breakfast?
No, I could
Wow.
leave breakfast entirely.
That's amazing.
Yeah. But I couldn't do without dinner. Like for me, it's like it's my favourite part of the day is with dinner. It's like the thing that I'm like headed towards. Yeah, so I would super miss that. I think.
Yeah, I'm the exact opposite then.
Yeah, right.
Breakfast is absolutely. There's no questions.
Oh, I know. Most days I could leave it. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where's the energy come from then?
I don't know. Let's just have a coffee. Something. Oh yeah, early lunch, especially when busy. Yeah. Sometimes I don't have breakfast or something. Otherwise, never miss it. Yeah.
I'm gonna come around. That's fine.
welcome. Thank you for coming to Larrimah Archives NT. My name is Wendy Garden and I'm the Assistant Director of Access and Engagement here at the library. First of all, before we begin, I'd like to just acknowledge that we're all meeting tonight on the land of the Larrimah people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and just acknowledge that we are on land that was never ceded. We're very lucky tonight to all be here for this fantastic book launch. This is a great book for the Northern Territory. I know I've been listening to the podcast and I'm sure lots of you have as well, about this very intriguing story in our own backyard. So we're very lucky to have both authors here tonight, both Kylie Stevenson and Larrimah Jordan. Before we begin, I'd like to just mention a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, the toilets are located outside the glass doors off to your right. We're going to be taking photos and filming the event tonight, so if you prefer not to have your photo taken, can you please let one of our team know instead of standing around the back there. We're still living with the COVID pandemic, so if you're feeling unwell, can you please notify one of our staff members, and please practice safe hygiene practices and there's sanitising around the library. And please turn your phones to silent. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing the facilitator for tonight's event, Liz Travascus. Liz is a well-known and acclaimed broadcaster and storyteller for ABC Darwin. After graduating from Swinburne University with a degree in media and communications, Liz travelled to Europe and had a wonderful opportunity of doing all sorts of things, such as working for the BBC and reporting from Germany during the World Cup, to volunteering at a newspaper at Durham, a refugee camp. On her return from Europe, she worked at Triple J and local radio in regional Victoria, and she's been at the top end for over a decade now and has contributed to ABC programs such as Drive in the evenings and NT Country Hour. Please welcome, join me in welcoming Liz Travascus.
Thank you, Wendy. I feel like I should curtsy with that introduction. Yes, my name is Liz Travascus. I, at the moment, host the Drive program on ABC Radio Darwin, which has actually only finished about 3 minutes ago. So I've raced over and left some stuff playing on the radio so that I could be here this evening. When Kylie got in touch to say, could I be a part of the book launch, I was going to do anything to make it happen because this is such a wonderful achievement, so I really wanted to be here this evening to be part of this really special event for these two ladies. I think you should just get on up here now. We've got Kylie Stevenson. Climb up onto these chairs, I think. Kylie Stevenson and Carolyn Graham, who are, of course, the authors of the book that we're all here to celebrate this evening, Larrimah. I would also like to acknowledge before we begin that we are gathered on the traditional lands of the Larrimah people and pay my respect to the elders, both past and present. Now, I'm going to ask Kylie and Caro questions for about 45 minutes. Then there'll be an opportunity for questions from the audience, so if there's something that we haven't managed to talk about, or if you've got some burning questions that you'd like to ask about the writing of the book, about the time they spent in Larrimah, or some of the incredible histories that they have uncovered as part of their research, we'll have an opportunity to do that. And then, of course, buy a book, which is what we're all here for this evening as well. So, Kylie, I know that you've been asked this question quite a few times, but I think it really is the best place to start this story. Can you take us back to the beginning and where the fascination with Larrimah began?
Yes, thanks, Liz. So in 2016, I was the inaugural recipient of the Andrew McMillan Writers Residency down in Larrimah. Andrew was a really well-known author in the Territory, and he used to go down to Larrimah to write. And when he passed away, he left some money to the Writers' Centre to send a writer down there every year. So I was the first one to go. I think I probably was the only person who applied that year, to be honest. And I spent 2 weeks down there just working on a novel that I was writing. But the whole time I was there, I was just, I was ducking out into the pub and having a beer with people and having a chat to whoever was around, and I just got completely captured by the place and pretty much threw my novel out the window and started writing about Larrimah, and that's been going on for 4 years now.
When was the moment that you chucked that other novel that you were working on out the window? Was there a person or a character or a story that just captivated you that you can remember from that first visit?
I can remember something. So 2 things. One was I was talking to someone there who he was a local, and he was just chatting away about trains or something, I don't know. And as he was talking, I realised there was a worm crawling across his face, and I hadn't even noticed. I had to call his attention to it. But probably the other thing was actually Caro, because there's no phone reception in Larrimah, but there is Wi-Fi at the pub. So the whole time I was messaging her, just telling her everything that was happening, and she was so enthusiastic. She was receiving my messages very kindly and replying, which was good because I was quite lonely there. And yeah, I think
I was the monster who said, burn your book, write this instead. And I promise that is also a good book, but...
And Carol, what can you remember about what Kylie was telling you, those little tidbits from the pub that she was texting you?
We actually went back to the messages quite recently, and there's this series of messages that kind of escalate in these wild stories. And I just, there's another message where I've woken up the next day and reread them and written back going, I've just reread all these, it's amazing, I'm so hooked. So it's just that feeling of it wasn't really like anywhere else. And, I was over on the East Coast in Queensland, and yeah, just totally transported from the start.
And so when did you first visit Larrimah, and what are your memories of that first visit there?
So first visit was with Kylie, the visit that later resulted in the podcast.
Do you want to hold that mic up?
Yeah, is that better? Yeah. So first visit was Kylie, the visit that later resulted in the podcast, and actually the strangest thing, so firstly it's tiny. It's really just 2 roads. They've got all of these signs to the pub, but there's no opportunity for a wrong turn. There's only 3 roads. And it looks like everything that you kind of collectively imagine the outback to look like. You've got this red dirt, you've got this gorgeous ramshackle pub. The only thing that's kind of distinctive is that it's painted bright pink and it's kind of peculiar. But I stepped out and it's also really lush. Like, even though it's harsh, they had this beautiful, there's bougainvillea everywhere, and they had this beautiful Rangoon creeper with these bright red flowers, and it smelled gorgeous, and it was kind of sunset in this isolated place, and I remember just being captured from the start.
That's a town that sounds like it's ripe for some pretty amazing stories. And of course, I think if people have listened to the podcast and people who live here, we all know the disappearance of Paddy Moriarty from Larrimah almost 4 years ago, which is a central part of this story. But that hadn't happened when you, Kylie, were first visiting on the writers' retreat, and Carol, I don't think that had happened when you first visited.
It had happened when we visited, yes.
And so, well, Kylie, tell me about when you had this story to write, and maybe it hadn't taken shape in terms of what the story was going to be, and then Paddy disappeared. How did that change your plans for telling the story of Larrimah?
Yeah, so I was already sort of planning a podcast just about the town and the people who live there. And then I was driving one day, I was doing laps around East Point because my son, who was running around somewhere, wouldn't have sleep unless I drove. So I was driving him around and heard that someone had gone missing in Larrimah. And my first thought was it's probably a tourist who, didn't take any water and they'd find them soon. And obviously that didn't happen, and then I found out it was Paddy, and he was one of the people that I had met when I was down there. So then the pitch that I was doing about the podcast sort of became more urgent, and weirdly, I thought the disappearance, that's an interesting thing to sort of draw in listeners, but the people I was pitching it to decided that actually that was too risky because it was an open investigation. So then I got Carol on board, and we ended up publishing it with The Australian.
Can you remember when you heard the news, Caro, and what that meant to you about this town that you've recently been sort of hooked into?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my involvement was always kind of vicarious through you and through other people in the town. But it's probably a little bit the feeling that so many of the residents in Larrimah had too, that sense of something awful happening within proximity. And there's probably even people in this room who kind of had that sense of hearing something on the news and being immediately affected by it. And yeah, I guess initially it was that missing persons case, and kind of, you know, by the end of that first week it became clear that it was probably something much more sinister.
Had you spent much time with Paddy? Did you feel like you knew him when that happened?
No, I always say I met Paddy. I don't say that I knew him, because I think that's maybe a bit insulting to his friends, the people who did know him really well. But I did have a few beers with him in that couple of weeks, because pretty much every time I wandered into the pub he was there. So we would just have a chat and have a beer, and his dog Rover was always hanging around. And yeah, I wish I had asked more questions, obviously, in hindsight.
I'm certain at this point that you do. His disappearance, December 2017, it sort of is the story that your story orbits around and changed the trajectory of your storytelling. When you started work on the book, did you set out to solve the mystery?
I don't think we really rated ourselves that highly as investigators, given that police had been working on it pretty extensively.
Did you hope?
Of course.
Because you know, investigative journalism does often uncover truths that police and other investigators don't. So you sort of slightly hoped that might be the case.
Certainly, I mean, we applied an investigative lens and pursued every lead earnestly. But I guess, I mean, sometimes there's a sense of these stories unfolding because there is something that's gone wrong in the investigation, or there's some sort of problem within the justice system, and this absolutely wasn't one of those cases.
And then what was it? Why has it been so hard for them to solve? I mean, I guess the book does explore this in sort of great detail, but why do you think it hasn't been solved?
I mean, partly it's landscape, so kind of at every turn the police are up against it. And that's right from the initial search. The week he went missing, it was up to sort of 47, 48 degrees some days. It had rained a number of times. There's obviously substantial wildlife in the area that might have been instrumental in kind of getting rid of any evidence. There's no phone reception, so basic communication was difficult. There's very few places to stay. So even as a search, it is just a mammoth, difficult exercise. And then as we were talking to so many of the police kind of through the process, every part of that investigation continues to be difficult. So in a town of 12 people, there's no surveillance, or certainly no covert surveillance. So someone in town did tell us actually quite a hilarious story about seeing kind of two people posing on the edge of town, who they think were undercover cops. You know, with 12 people, you can really only hang around and have a beer for a couple of hours before people start asking you what you're doing there.
They just went up to this guy and were like, yeah, nice work. You're really blending in.
They were.
I don't know. We have asked and they won't tell us.
Did you ever think that you'd gotten close throughout this investigation of solving the mystery?
I think there are so many possibilities, and every time we kind of, in our minds, settle on something that we think is probably the most likely thing to have happened, then, you know, a day later we're in another place with it. So, yeah, I think at times we felt like we were, but we swing wildly between, you know, the different things that we think could have happened.
And it must feel like, even after all the investigation that you did, which was very much hampered by COVID restrictions, that there are still stones to upturn. Are you hoping that the book might trigger someone's memory, that, you know, in coming weeks or months, this book might provide some answers?
Yeah. You know, I think as long as Paddy is being talked about, there's always a chance that someone will remember something, or, you know, be sort of, you know, prepared to come forward and say something that they know.
As I said, the book is so much around Paddy's disappearance. He's there beautifully on the front cover. It is a story about the town of Larrimah, but it's sort of more than that as well. Caro, what do you think this is a book about? What did you set out to explore, and what do you actually think the book has become?
I think maybe naively when we first set out, because of the size of the town, so you've got 12 people, it's kind of 800 metres end to end. We sort of thought if we came in and we talked to everyone and we kind of pursued every lead, that we would be close, at least for ourselves, to an answer. So we thought it was this quite contained story. And after 3 years and probably 600 phone calls, I can tell you it is not contained. We've done thousands and thousands of kilometres of driving all over the place. And I think, for us it's a couple of things. Obviously it's honouring Paddy's story. Secondly, I think it's the town. It's such an extraordinary place and it has so much wonderful history. We wanted there to be some record of that. But also, we had this sense that Larrimah was precariously close to disappearing, and it is not the only town in outback Northern Territory, or even just in Australia generally, that is kind of hovering on the cusp of being a ghost town. So yeah.
The World War II history that you've uncovered as part of the research and that has made it into the book is fascinating. Tell me about that part of the story and the research.
Sure.
This is your area of expertise.
We went through all the archives and stuff. So there was about 6,000 soldiers who were stationed in Larrimah. There were some American soldiers, thousands and thousands of them, stationed a few kilometres south. And there was also an air base at Gorrie, just a couple of kilometres north. So probably close to 10,000 soldiers in that area. And everyone talks about it. During World War II, it was vitally important to both Australia and America's war effort. They say part of the war in the Pacific was directed from the veranda of the pub. So hugely important and also just deathly boring. So you just imagine there's like 10,000 soldiers, they've just been plonked in the middle of the bush. We found this great record by one of the doctors who was there, and it's like an episode of Monty Python. The first doctor who got sent there to build the hospital got to Alice Springs and he was like, I'm going to Larrimah to build the hospital. They're like, you can't do that, there's no hospital. And he's like, I know, I'm going to build it. And they were like, no. So he got into a fight with them, he stole a car, drove it to Larrimah on this road that was so bad it gave people appendicitis. And because he angered so many people, all their tents disappeared, so they had no tents. So they were just like literally building their beds out of saplings. They were baking bread in termite mounds as ovens. Like it was a disaster. And a really boring, turgid disaster. They were there for years, some of them. They came up with all of these ways of entertaining themselves. They made like ant-bed tennis courts, they had horse races, but it was so dusty no one could ever tell who won. They raced lizards.
Describe the tennis court.
The tennis court made out of like termite mounds. They'd been petitioning the Australian Army to come and give them some entertainment, and finally this sort of weird old white hat man turned up. He's like, I'm here to build your tennis court. And he just kind of crunched down all these termite mounds. But they had no rackets or net or balls. So they wove this net out of old Women's Weekly magazines. And they played volleyball as well, but all they had was a medicine ball. It was like 40 degrees. It's like the worst sport imaginable.
So Caro has done an incredible job in this book of capturing this extraordinary, unbelievable, how did you describe it, impossible Monty Python language?
And also they all got totally sick, so the hospital there, but not with the kind of casualties you'd expect in war. People were just getting sunburnt through their clothes. They all got like scrotal dermatitis because it's so hot. Just a disaster.
There's a lot of laughs to be had, and Caro's described these are the two of them because of course they have written this book together, which is quite an extraordinary thing. You'll find yourself really swept up in the history and then pissing yourself laughing. It's really, really wonderful. Kylie, I asked you if you had a couple of non-Paddy related bits of local history that you love. What's your favourite one?
There's a few. I worked pretty hard to get this world-beating sized, enormous pumpkin in Bachelor in there. Like I found this story about it. It was apparently the biggest pumpkin in the world, grown in Bachelor, and was supposed to be going on this like Australia-wide tour, And before that happened, it got stolen. Police investigation. No one ever discovered what happened to the pumpkin. Anyway, I found that, and we were like, "How can we get that in? There's nothing. The Bachelor is not in this book." We worked pretty hard, and we got it in there. But there are a lot of stories like that.
Can you tell us the Tom Nugent story?
Tom Nugent, yeah. This was a guy. We went down to Tennant Creek. Everyone we were looking for down there was like, we spent so long looking for them. We had all these people helping us find them, and we get there and they'd just be like, "Nah, don't know anything." And we were like, "Why did we drive all the way to this town?" And everyone kept saying, "You see this guy Billy?" So we went looking for this guy Billy. Like, we spent the whole day looking for him. He was on dialysis. We had to like wait for him to finish dialysis. And someone was like, "His car's parked around the corner. Just go in that house." And he didn't know anything either. But he then spent 2 hours telling us how he was the grandson of Tom Nugent, who was sort of the Ned Kelly of the North. And it was great. We loved it. We didn't care that we didn't use it. It was 2 hours well spent.
What about the piano accordion story?
Oh yeah, so the other research I did was I spent a lot of time at the NT Archives going through decades of police diaries from when Larrimah had a police station, and there was a lot of strange crimes in there. There's a lot of cattle duffing. There was a lot of just people reporting their pants had been stolen off the line. Everything went into this police diary. But my favourite one was someone reported their piano accordion had been stolen from their shed. And I kept thinking about it for ages. It was probably annoying Caro with how much I thought about this piano accordion, because like, how do you steal a piano accordion? But then there's not that many people living around there. Doesn't someone go, "That guy didn't have a piano accordion and I did have one. That is probably my piano accordion." The crime was, it was never solved. I'd like to get to the bottom of that.
So many unsolved mysteries. But I'd love to see what happens if you guys investigate. Did that story make it into the book, or that's just another one of the great stories?
It's a very brief mention in there, I think. Yeah.
What about getting bogged? Was there some research around getting bogged?
I did one day fall down a rabbit hole. So one of the guys who lives in Larrimah, his grandfather was Lassiter, the guy who claims there was a gold reef in the middle of Australia. And I was reading some stuff on him that I found some rare stuff in the archives, and one of them was this guy's account of being with Lassiter and them having these camels and the camel getting bogged in the desert. And I was like, that sounds weird. Do camels normally get bogged, or is that weird, or is it just something that happens all the time when camels are out in the desert? I don't know. And for like half a day I was just Googling camels being bogged. Turns out it's not that common.
Actually, another good getting bogged story. So pretty much everything that the Northern Territory has tried to do has sort of failed in that geographic region as well. So the Transcontinental Railway kind of ended there, and it was a bit of a disaster. The Overland Telegraph Line, and part of the reason is because it's what they call black soil country. So it gets really, really boggy when it's wet. And so every time they tried to build the Stuart Highway, in the wet season, it would just sort of disappear in that area. And there's a story in the 50s of like 100 metres of that road just disappearing, and these 5 trucks getting bogged up to their axles, like the whole thing just sank.
Very funny parts of territory history, but there are also undoubtedly sad and uncomfortable parts of the territory history that you've come across as part of your research. Can you sort of describe some of those stories, Caro?
Yeah, of course. So I guess partly because we're looking at what happens to outback towns like Larrimah and like a lot of towns on and off the Stuart. I think we've got to be honest about some of, the historical and contextual reasons that some of those places are difficult to inhabit. Going up and down, there's just so much generational trauma. There's really so a lot of people in Larrimah had told us that there were no First Nations people in Larrimah because locals call it Karachi country. And of course, when we looked into that, it wasn't quite true, like so many of the things we looked into. But essentially what had happened is a lot of the traditional owners had either been run off the land or had been killed in massacres. And that there are very few of those traditional owners left. There is now actually one of the traditional owners has taken back some of that land in a land claim, and he lives out there full time.
Were there any less funny pieces of history that have sort of stayed with you from the research for the book, Kylie?
Yeah, one that I got kind of swept up in was there's a town just south of Larrimah called Burdham, which no longer exists. And back in the 30s, there was a family that lived there. They were a really interesting family. They'd ended up there because the father had been running, this didn't make him either actually. He had gotten into a fight with Ned Kelly, and I think he stabbed him with a pick or something. I can't remember now. Anyway, he had to leave there, so he ended up in Burdham. And his son-in-law was killed out there in 1936, a guy called Bill Jacobson. And we had heard that his family had gone back there 70 years later to sort of commemorate Bill's life, and a couple of the people that had gone were his daughters. And we spent so long trying to track them down, and we just had to assume that they were no longer living after a while. But then I found Ethel, his daughter, who had lived in Burdham until she was 6, and had been there with her father the day he'd been killed. And it was a really interesting story to capture because she lived her whole life not knowing what had happened to her father, and that's sort of, where a lot of Paddy's friends sit at the moment.
I asked you when we did an interview for radio earlier this week if you ever felt frightened or scared out in these vast landscapes that are known so much for their lawlessness, people trying to escape the law, and both of you were like, no, actually no, because I think you were thinking about the people and the characters. But I get the sense that at times throughout the years of research, the landscape was probably pretty frightening. Tell us a bit about the fear of the land and the wildlife.
Yeah, while we were researching, we asked someone to describe the landscape for us. We'd been down there, but it's nice to kind of hear other people talk about it. And someone described it as flat and featureless, which doesn't sound terrifying until you think about being lost somewhere, and that would be probably the two most terrifying adjectives you could come up with. It's really easy to get turned around out there. There are snakes, there are sinkholes, there's all manner of wildlife.
Whenever we went out, I was just terrified of being bitten by a snake, because every time we talked to a local with it, like unprompted, they would just tell us 10 stories of snakes in their backyard, like enormous snakes, death adders, taipans that hoe into you.
It's like a national pastime.
And the sinkholes as well. This isn't something I knew about, the territory landscape. What kind of problem are the sinkholes?
Yes. It's to do with it being limestone country, and there's caves underneath, so I'm probably butchering this. Our sinkhole expert would be horrified, but broadly what happens is that there's a cave underneath and the water settles, and eventually it just kind of crumbles and you can fall in. And so there are lots of sinkholes out there, and actually there was a case not that long ago in Queensland. It was an SES worker. They were walking shoulder to shoulder through the bush around Ipswich, and someone just disappeared and went 15 foot down a sinkhole. So it does happen. She was okay. She sprained her ankle, but it happens.
We've sort of moved out from Larrimah and the town and Paddy into this amazing history, which I just love as part of this story that you've told. But I want to zoom back into Larrimah and the characters, which is what so captured you right at the very beginning. And I just want to ask you about someone else who you lost through this process, Barry Sharp, who was the publican at the pub. Can you tell us about the role that he played in your time that you spent in Larrimah, and just tell us a bit more about this guy who I think you would have called a friend at the end of this?
Yeah, definitely. So Barry was running the pub when I first went down there in 2016, and I spent a bit of time with him then. And because we were always staying at the pub, you know, we got to know him pretty well. He was always hanging around. He was not necessarily up for a beer by the time we were down there. He was pretty unwell, but he was always up for a cup of tea with us. He always had the ABC on very loud in the bar. And yeah, we just got to know him really well, and we really liked Barry, and yeah, we really miss him.
He sort of represents all the really charming parts of that lifestyle too. He's the kind of publican who, instead of having a till, he just had a cutlery drawer insert with a tea towel over it, and that's where he was keeping everything.
Kevin is the one who revealed that to me, actually. Kevin used to work at the Larrimah Hotel.
Was that Kevin?
Oh, the till broke down. I said, we need to buy a new till. He said, we can't afford one, so I got a knife and fork drawer, and that was the new till.
Very good. We might have to see if we can get another story from Kevin before we wrap things up.
Stories are great.
Obviously a really sad loss for you to have made a friend throughout this process, and you pay tribute to Barry really beautifully in the book. Did you make other friends throughout this? Are there people that you consider friends that you're still in touch with?
Yeah, I would consider them friends. I don't know how they feel about us, so I'm going to talk to that. But they, yeah, definitely there are people who, when they're in Darwin, we catch up with them, we go out for a drink. Actually tonight, really funny, did I show you that message from Fran?
Oh yeah.
So, Fran Hodgetts, who used to live in Larrimah, who's now living in Melbourne, who ran the tea house across the road from Paddy's place, her grandson is now running the place, Brent. And I just, before we got up here, I had a message from Brent, and he's like, hey, are you just launching a book in Larrimah today? Because it's real dead down here, but Pop said he heard it on the radio or something.
We apologise to anyone who's accidentally gone to Larrimah. It's a big drive.
That is a 10-hour round trip, very sorry.
So you're still in touch with Brent, Fran's son, who probably grandson who only came into the piece sort of further on, didn't he? He's only been there a couple of years. Are you regularly in touch with the other residents of Larrimah?
Yeah, we
The ones who have phones, there's not that many of them. Yes.
I mean, we get these beautiful vignettes of these characters, and I think people will feel like they've known them, and of course they're not characters, they're, you know, they're people who live in a top-end town. But is there anyone out of them, I was wondering, who maybe deserve their own story, their own book?
Do. Every one of them.
Everyone.
Yeah.
100% position endless stories.
Anyone in particular that comes to mind, first cab off the rank?
Carl and Bobby Roth have lived a really interesting life. They've lived in Darwin. They met at the drag races in Darwin in the 70s. And then they lived in Alice Springs for a long time. And they just have an endless amount of go-on anecdotes. It's just, every time you sit down with them, it's a new one. You're like, how have I not heard this one before?
And it's always totally casual, like you kind of sit down and they'll pull out, like the kind of story where it would be, if it was my life, it would be the best story, and I would just pull it out the first time I met anyone. And it would be meeting number 50. They'd just be casually pulling out something, be like, how have you buried it for this long?
One of the best ones was when we were there, they told us, it only happened a couple of years ago or something, that Bobby noticed that the fish were disappearing from their fish pond in the backyard. So she said to Carl, can you check it out? I think it's leaking or something. And he parted the lilies and there was this huge croc in there. And they were like, how did this thing get in here? And they realised that there was a croc over at the pub that no longer was at the pub, and that was probably that croc. But that was the prank. Like, it was like a long game because it was a few years between when that croc went missing and when they found it in their fish pond. And then the best part of the story was, so they rang up Passing Wildlife and said, you know, you need to come and get this croc. And they were like, well, okay, we'll come tomorrow. And they're like, oh no, I'm gonna go to Catherine tomorrow. We'll just they put a dog lead on it, tied it up in their carport and put a sprinkler on it and just left it there for the Parks and Wildlife guys to pick up.
So Carl and Bobby,
they're the best.
that is the story. The past 4 years since Paddy disappeared, and there's still there was a coronial inquiry which you guys attended for part of for the book. It's in the book there, and still no answers. What toll has it taken on the residents of Larrimah these past 4 years?
I think it depends on what their relationship to Paddy was. there are some people who do not give a shit, but there are a lot of people who were very close to him, and you know, it's definitely an absence that sort of haunts them daily. And they obviously are very invested in finding out what happened to him.
What was it like going to that coronial inquest? I was sort of fascinated to get some insight into that. We don't often hear a lot of, you know, we get court reports and that kind of thing in TV news and in newspapers, but not often real insight into the coronial process. What was that like? And to have all of those residents have to kind of lay their lives and their relationships with Paddy quite bare?
Yeah, everyone is so candid that I don't think it was any different. I don't think it brought up anything that police probably hadn't already heard. But it was just the most fascinating court experience you can ever imagine. I have covered magistrates' court before as a reporter, but this was just enthralling. I remember coming out on one of the last days, and Matt Cunningham was there from Sky News, and he was just like, what on earth do you lead with? There was just so many interesting bits of information there. It was impossible to write a story, you know, to 500 words at the time was really hard. The people who are the stars of this story, those 11 or 12 or 10 or 14 or 9, it sort of throughout the books expands and contracts at different points, the number of people who call Larrimah home. It's a big thing to take people's lives and shape it into a story, and you guys have done it with amazing heart. There's no, you know, you're not taking the piss out of these larger than life characters, which I think is a really beautiful achievement. I think often when we tell stories about people who have lived big lives, and I saw it happen during the coverage of Paddy's disappearance. I think there was an interview with Fran on 7:30 that just made me cringe, because they just seemed to be taking the piss, not out of just her, but also us by extension. So not a question, just a comment that you guys have done a really wonderful job with that. But do the residents know how the book has turned out? Have they read it? Did they get final approval about how you told their stories?
Yeah, I think we've been as transparent as we could be with all of the sort of deadlines and stuff. So anyone who's wanted to see their part, or in some cases the whole book, has had access to that in advance. And actually the changes we had back were very minor. There's one, well, I hope she doesn't mind me telling this. There's someone in there who I described as a grandmother, who requested to be a young grandmother. Made her feel old.
Has Fran read the book?
I don't know, actually. Brent has read it. He told us it was the first book he'd ever read in his life, so that was quite honoured to, you know, have that title. I don't know. I know that she is quite unwell at the moment.
Paddy, of course, disappeared. You lost Barry throughout the process of writing this book. And you foreshadowed this at the beginning of our conversation. There's another disappearance that is foreshadowed in the book, which is sort of the disappearance of what to many people would probably seem like this mythical outback life, but is real and does exist. Do you have an idea from this experience what you think the future of Larrimah is, and that strange outback pub?
It's strange. So in some ways we've wrestled with this question, and we don't really know how a place like Larrimah survives in the long term. It doesn't have any industry to speak of. Most of its residents are starting to get on in years, but also Larrimah should really never have existed at any stage of its lifespan, and it is just this tenacious place that hangs on against the odds. So I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, there's kind of throughout the process there's been sometimes, you know, the opportunity of farming there. If other industry goes ahead, that might change things for the town. But also those promises kind of come and go, and no one holds a lot of stock in them, at least the residents there.
And the future of the pub that we've heard, you know, when Barry was in charge, had a cutlery drawer for a till. Do you have some insight into the future of the pub?
There is a scanner there now, so it's pretty flash. Yeah, the new owner is obviously making his stamp on the place and has been changing things a little bit.
think the word we used was gentrified.
Yes.
So plans for a light show.
There is a plan for a light show, and when the new owner was telling us about this grand plan for a light show, Carol and I were just going, there's no door on the bathroom in our room. Like, can you just get us a door? Like, a light show. We had like this thin blue curtain between us. It was very intimate.
We're only a few minutes away from wrapping up before, if you guys have any questions, I'll throw things over to you. But I've asked Caro if she's happy to read a little bit of the book for us this evening, and she said yes, so we're going to get her to do that. And then I just had a little anecdote that Kylie was going to finish up with before we do wrap things up. So you've got
It's
the
kind of a
page
terrifying
here.
request. It turns out that
Can you hold the
reading a
mic
book
and
is more terrifying than writing a book.
Cara gets to read it because it turned out I was very, very bad at reading a book.
So this is from chapter 32. The title of this chapter is A Vegan Dog, a Stuffed Panda, and 13 Death Adders in a Jar. Lenny is shirtless, sucking a blackcurrant Zupa Duper, sitting in the detritus of his shed. He half-heartedly tells us to make ourselves comfortable, but there's nowhere to sit, and it's the kind of heat that would tempt you to snatch a half-melted ice block out of an old man's hand. As if sensing this, Lenny folds the top of the packet and deposits the small puddle of purple safely in the freezer. Those biscuits you bought were pretty good, he says, of the home-baked shortbread we'd given him on the way down. It seems such a long time ago now. I mean, they were a bit tasteless and a bit crumbly. There was something missing. Did you forget to add something? Like some flavour? It needed more flavour. We laugh it off, but the review of our baking is a little galling, given that Lenny's got 2 teeth, is sitting beside a camp stove where he's been using an enamel plate as a fry pan, and the only thing in his fridge and freezer is the half Zupa Duper. Lenny points out the crack in the floor that tripped him up a few weeks ago. Got me good, hey, he says, gesturing to the cut on his forehead, which has healed a little since we were last in town, but still doesn't look great. We think back to Judy's comment about Lenny needing a will, and wonder who this mess will fall to when he dies. They're trying to get me to go to a retirement home, and what would I do with all this? He gestures around at his collections. Anyway, I hate those places. You go in, and the only way you come out is feet first, in a box. I told them that at the clinic, and they did not like that. Lenny grins, but we try not to think of Barry in his own final days in Larrimah, clinging on to the freedom he'd spent his life enjoying, only to find it had become its own terrible prison. Anyway, Lenny goes on, live as ever. My parents both lived to be 85, so I'm hoping to at least outlast them. We ask how old Lenny is. 84, he replies. My birthday's next month. There's a long silence. We don't know what to say, so we suggest a cup of tea at Cookie's place next door, and Lenny says he'll come too. On the way, we pass one of Lenny's 8 cars. There's a swag in the back with a 3-foot plush panda on top of it. I picked that up at the dump, he tells us. There were heaps of stuffed toys there, all in really good condition. I'm going to sell them.
Thank you, Caro. And you might have heard them commenting, or Kylie was saying it turns out she's not very good at reading. I think she's talking about the experience of recording the audio book. So if you love the book and the podcast, you can also get an audio book in your ears as well. So I'm sure you did a fantastic job, Kylie. So I did want to finish up with one last story from Kylie. And we started out with your fascination with Larrimah and the Writers' Retreat, but I don't think that's really where this story starts. It actually starts with the first time that you ever came to the Northern Territory on a school trip when you were 15 years old, and you told me that there are 2 really clear memories that stand out. If you can share those with us.
Yeah, so just to make it clear, that makes it sound like I went to a fancy school, and I did not. I went to a very dodgy public school in Sydney. So we came to the Northern Territory, I think it was about 1994, and there are 2 things that I really remember clearly, and the first is sitting on the grass out the front of the museum and looking out over Fanny Bay, and I remember saying to my friend, I'm going to come back here. And it took me 15 years, but I did get back here. And the other memory that really stuck with me was that we went out to Heartbreak Hotel, which is a place that Patty worked at for about 10 years out near Borroloola. And I remember our school coach pulling up in the car park there, and this group of men who were sitting drinking on the veranda turned around and mooned our bus. And when we were out there, we went out there and met a woman who worked with Patty out there for
When you were
years.
out there for the book?
Yeah, and she was telling us when Patty had been there, I realised that actually he probably was one of those asses that I saw when we met.
I thought that was a lovely place to end things. The Larrimah journey began for Kylie well before she even lived in the Northern Territory and even had any concept of this place or these people, and there's no doubt, and I'm sure you'll agree when you do read the book, that she loves this place and that Cara loves this place. Well done. The floor is now open. If anyone has questions that they'd like to ask these guys, I didn't really ask them about the process of writing the book together, any of the adventures that they had or characters that they met. And we've got a little bloke with a question here.